rock that kept its own counsel stood black and vertical against the North Atlantic. A spearpoint of stone hammered by centuries of wind and white water. They called it Háidrangur in the old maps, the High Rock. But for as long as men had told of it, the islanders around Vestmannaeyjar had only one short way to name it, the rock that would not be tamed. It rose like an accusation from the sea, a few miles off the ragged coast, one of 3 jagged teeth the ocean left when it chewed away at the shoreline. On the tallest of the 3, a little white hut with a red lantern was perched like a stubborn eye, watching ships that sometimes never saw it until it was too late. They built the light because they had to. The South Atlantic swell, the hidden shoals, the weather that could change like a fist. All of it made the southern approach to the Westman Islands a surrender or storm road for mariners. The decision to crown that lonely pillar with a light was as practical as prayer. Give sailors a mark in the dark where otherwise there was only a moor. The project began in the long shadow of war. Men hauled drills and spikes, chains and raw courage into small boats and clung to rock faces slick with spray. They threaded iron into stone, adding length to the climbing route link by link until the top could be reached. The concrete house they built was small, squat, and whitewashed, a battered sentry that seemed to have been planted there by the sea itself. Construction was completed before the world descended into open conflict, but the lamp did not glow until later, when wartime delays and the cutting of supply lines kept the light dark for years. Eventually, it was lit, a beacon's first breath, and the rock became at last a lighthouse. There are people who will tell you the ocean keeps records in its own language, and that those who listen can read the ledger of grief the waves keep. The ledger for Háidrangur started almost immediately. During construction, men slipped. A handhold gave way, a spike tore from soft rock, a small knapsack tumbled into the void below and carried with it a name. The local newspapers of the day, where they bothered to print dispatches from such a remote work site, printed lists of supplies and short quotes from engineers. The names of the dead were little more than footnotes. The families remembered differently, not in typed lines, but in bread-crusted chairs and voices that hardened when the wind blew from the south. That was the first ache attached to the light, a handful of men swallowed by a winter sea that would not forget. The official records are spare. Memory makes the rest. If you visit Vestmannaeyjar in summer, the sailors who still come alongside the tourist boats will point out the white dot far off the horizon and say the same thing. It is ruined for other men, but not for ghosts. They say the lighthouse was always lonely in life and lonelier still in death. That in the raw hours before dawn, the lamps at the top sometimes glow with a stubbornness that is not merely mechanical, but clinical, an insistence that someone is keeping watch. The keepers, the islanders tell you, were a particular breed, men who understood isolation the way some men understand grief. They rotated in and out of the hut, by rope and small boats at first, later by helicopter. They left behind the pragmatic logs, dates of oil deliveries, the timing of the flash, and sometimes they left behind scraps of themselves, a knitted glove, an old photograph, a hymn book browned at the edges. Those items became signals to the next man who lived there. They were proof that someone else had felt the same cold pressing at his bones. The lighthouse's official life, its dates, its numbers, sat humbly alongside the more human ledger. They recorded that the structure's light could be seen for nearly 9 nautical miles when visibility allowed, that its beacon pulsed in a long and short rhythm. They later automated aspects of the lamp, and long after the first men had carved the route with chain and clamps, a helipad would be added to the tiny roof, so that rescue and maintenance would no longer depend entirely on the sweet temper of the weather. These changes were progress, but where machines replaced men, story only grew more tenacious, They said machines could keep the lamp burning, but machines could not, tell stories. The heart of the tale is the man who signed the log with a shaky hand one winter in 1951, and whose name is now almost entirely forgotten, except in the hush that falls when the veteran fishermen speak of the winter that would not end. His name was Einar. He was broad-shouldered and taciturn, the kind of man who let a task be his tongue. The islanders had sent him out because he was reliable and because he smoked slowly and thought through the space between words. He came to the light with a crate of coal and a young shepherd's dog named Skuggi, who had been given to him by a widow who said it would keep him company and chase away loneliness. Skuggi padded after Einar on the perilous ascent, the little chain-slung path up the stack, and watched with patient eyes as men hammered in the last links and bolted the door. For a while, the world shrank to the size of a white hut and a lantern. Einar kept the books, checked the mechanism, and wrote short, functional notes about the sea. The first signs were small. A cup moved from its place, a raincoat hung in the wrong direction. The dog startled and lowered its head as though listening to a weightless argument. Einar wrote strange noises in the margin of a log entry, circled it, underlined it twice, and crossed it out. The word ghost did not appear. Einar was a man of measurement, not of myth. But once, in the white hour of a dawn that tasted like rust, the radio whispered in a voice that could have been a human voice saying, not a coordinate or weather note, but the name of a drowned man, Jonas. There had been a Jonas in the islands once, a deckhand whose body was recovered in spring after a shift of nets. The timing of the sound sent the dog keening into a corner as though hearing a tune its species had never learned to understand. Einar wrote, voice on radio, possible interference, Jonas, and then left the question hanging like a seam. He woke later with the radio crackling the same name into the dark. If the sea keeps a ledger, there are those who say the pages sometimes appear in other places. A fisherman in Vestmannaeyjar swore to his granddaughter that he once found a wet boot miles inland on a beach where no boat had capsized. A woman who had been taken out as a child to look at the lighthouse swore she had seen a lanky shadow pacing on the helipad, as if it were waiting for a ferry that would never come. These are the kinds of stories that grow tongue and teeth in the kitchen light, small, replicable moments that stitch themselves to the structure and make silence luminous. When the keepers changed schedule, each new man found that the old man had not entirely left. Notes appeared in margins in different hands, replying to each other as though the logs themselves were a kind of conversation across time. Don't be foolish, one keeper scrawled. Another replied, who is to say what is foolish and what remembers? The margins bloomed into a private palimpsest. The serious accident, the thing the islanders dropped into the sea like a stone and watched the ripples go out, happened in a storm that remembered every name the islanders had ever cursed into wind. A trawler, heavy laden, misread the approach in the teeth of the gale. The captain thought the beacon was further south, and the boat ran its hull upon a reef that the lighthouse had tried to warn him away from. The ship broke like a loaf. Men went into the water in pairs and singles, and the sea took its reckoning. Some were rescued by a miracle of weather and muscle, and a boat that surged like a living thing. Others were only remembered in the hollow silence that follows a ship going down. The lighthouse watchers that night kept their light steady and steady again, metal against storm, and afterward they wrote the names into the log as though writing were a way to hold them from falling. The town had wakes, and the church kept candles for a week. Those deaths gave the light a second layer to its ledger, not just the deaths of construction, but the deaths the light could not prevent. The story of that night became the story people told, instead of the story about how the lighthouse saved sailors. Sometimes it had done what it could, and still the ocean would claim its due. This account is fictionalized around the known dangers of the area and the lighthouse's role guiding vessels. Specific shipwreck details are narrative invention. It is easier to tell a tragedy in two halves: the external event and the private translation of that event into an interior world. For Einar, the storm brought guilt he could not reconcile. He had kept the light. He had serviced the lamp that week. He had watched the they that did not know their location steer a course into granite. After, he stopped sleeping. He left notations that read like fractured prayers. Could I have done more? If the radio had held, he took to pacing the helipad at midnight, as if the rocking of the sea had relocated inside his chest. People saw him in town, staring into cups, hands like rope. He wrote a name across the margin of a log in a hand that looked younger than his. And then, one night, he simply did not come in from the helipad. They found his weathered boots at the lip of the rock, sat neatly, facing the ocean, with no sign he had tried to climb down. In the kitchen, the kettle still sat half full. Skuggi, the dog, was gone too. There were no tracks from the little hut out toward the cliff, only the normal smudge of sea air and the suggestion that perhaps the ocean had opened a door and taken him. The islanders said he had stepped into the swell on purpose. Others swore no sane man would have done that the wind sings to men and makes movement where there was none. Some nights, fishermen swore they saw him, Einar, standing at the lamp's iron rim, peering out as though he had not yet trusted the world to hold its shape. Whether this was hallucination, grief, or the island translating its own loneliness into names was left to the type of person you asked. If you asked the fishermen, they would simply say, "We see what is there to see." The logbooks had his name until the ink bled away. When the keepers began to leave the lighthouse for longer periods, as diesel and helicopter solutions made continuous human presence less necessary, the island's stories shifted. Automations kept the lamp with the same regular pulse. The helipad welcomed brief flashes of human life for maintenance. Some thought this would quiet the place. Machines do not keep company with grief. But the opposite happened. The stories that needed people to hold them now had to do their holding through small objects and odd sounds. Tourists would later post pictures of the lamp literally glowing at twilight, and the photographers would caption the photos with the same line, over and over. "It looks like it's watching." Photographs multiplied the myth, and the myth multiplied the photographs. For a while, the lighthouse had its moment of strange celebrity on the internet. An isolated pinprick of human fascination where before it had been only a navigational device. Ghosts are stubborn. They are not bound by the logic of men. In stories passed between the old deckhands and the young, the ghost that haunted Háidrangur was not simply one man, but a confluence. The young deckhand who had been pulled from rope and tie. The engineer who had wrapped chain around his knuckles and never again felt warmth. The keeper who had misread the weather for too long. The ones who had been born into islands where hunger and tempest were early teachers. They were not always malignant. Sometimes they were small consolations. A cup found warm on the counter, though no one had been near. The scent of pipe tobacco in an empty room. The sound of a small footstep over the helipad at the precise moment a helicopter's shadow crossed the rock. Other times the presences were cruel and particular. Lights that blinked in Morse where no light should be. A language of knocks on the rafters. Before a storm, as if the sea kept a tally and wanted to be counted. Whether these were hauntings or the sea making language from absence depends on the listener. The keeper who followed Einar, a man named Gudmundur, tried a different approach. He left out a chair, placed a bowl of porridge on the table, and lit a candle for anyone who might be cold and lonely. He spoke aloud, sometimes, into the empty air, telling stories from the town, reading aloud from old poems. He was a practical man who had once been a teacher. He believed in ritual. For a while, it seemed to help. The knock slowed. The radio stayed rational, and Skuggi, or a dog very like him, listened with a softened head. Gudmundr wrote in the log in long, calm sentences. "It is good to name," he wrote one night. "Naming matters here." The journal grew a new margin of annotations. Men came for maintenance and left the kettle full and the chair in its place. Tourists called it quaint and romantic and took pictures to sell as postcards. But on the last morning, Gudmundur read the tide wrong. He missed the shift of current and the supply boat could not cast a rope where it should have. He screamed into the foam and the sea answered. He was rescued, yes, and his skin peeled like old paint from the cold. He never again read aloud there. Some men cannot allow the island its silence. There were patterns worth noticing if you had the patience to stand by the lamp. Births and deaths in time, almost precisely speaking to each other, as if the lighthouse kept a calendar where human hours were written in salt. The sea breaks everything down and then rearranges it. A hat here, a bone there. For sailors and fishermen, for those whose lives were measured by soundings and lines, the lighthouse became a living liturgy. You could see grief in the way the fishermen looked toward it in April, when the storms were still hungry. You could see hope in the way young men would stand at the pier and squint at its white dot and make plans to be out beyond where the cliffs began. The stories told inside the taverns by men with nets in their hands fed the lighthouse back with song. The lighthouse fed them back with an inscrutable light. The island learned to perform its sorrow in small, insistent acts. Once, years after the big wreck that took the trawler, a visiting journalist asked an old woman why the community still left a bowl of fresh water on the main pier each full moon. She answered simply, so the sea might have its share too. That was the kind of logic only those who live with the sea can keep, barter with it in rituals small enough to live with. Whether those rituals appeased anything is unknown, but they made sense of the senseless for a while. People needed story, and the lighthouse provided one stitched from stone, lamp, and impossible weather. By the time the internet made the lighthouse itself into an image circulated around the world, someone had already written a novel using its silhouette, and a music video had staged a performance on its helipad. The world liked the picture of loneliness. It felt modern and antique at once. Photographers climbed cliffs to frame it, and the less careful ones used drones until a local ordinance forbade the buzzing devices near the stacks. That outlawing did not stop the photos, and the photos did not stop the rumour that at night there was sometimes a second light, dim and orange, moving like a human lantern down the steps of some unseen path. Sightings like this never matched. They varied by season and amount of drink the teller had consumed. But patterns are not entirely meaningless, and enough people reported small, similar details that something sat on the edge of credibility. Sometimes the lighthouse seemed to mirror a human life in slow, melancholic ways. People like a tidy ending. The island had none, so it made its own by repetition. Keepers came and stayed and left. Accidents happened, and the recounting reshaped them into cautionary sermons. Machines took over lamps, and machines failed sometimes, reminding men of their limitations. The stories accumulated, weighted like gulls on wire, and the lighthouse grew into its identity wholly and finally outside the purely functional. It belonged to memory now, as much as to navigation. On still nights when the wind has no appetite, when the moon skates low and the sea becomes a sheet of mercury, fishermen sometimes say they can hear the lighthouse breathe. It's a private thing, not a sound one could place on a tape. A sigh that might be the ocean, might be the lamp, might be the remembering of 1,000 small deaths and 1,000 small mercies. They say if you listen long enough, you can make out a rhythm in the sigh, like a footfall, like the measure of a human thing counting until it forgets the count. Modern men speak of it with wry humour. Old men use a quieter voice. The tourists who download the photos might never know how thin the line is between what was and what might be. The lighthouse is both. If there is a final chapter to this place, it is not a dramatic note, but a continuation. The light still burns on its little island in the far ocean, stubborn and patient. It continues to mark hazards, to claim a silhouette on a map, to hum an old signal through fog and hail. It continues to be a place for human stories, for loss, for memory, for ritual, and for the occasional miracle of rescue. And under every official entry in a nautical register, there is, tucked like a small, folded scrap of unbanked currency, a margin where people have written their more private notations. There are notes that read like apologies, like small pleas. For Jonas, a light. For the crew of the trawler. For Einar, who kept the flame. The ocean keeps the ledger, we add the names. Some of us believe the act of writing a name sends a letter out into the dark. Some of us believe the sea opens its pocket and slides the letter back, uncaring. Either way, the lighthouse stands, and in the margins the world keeps speaking to itself. The last recorded keeper in the old style, who spent a winter up there and left journals that smell faintly of coal and salt, wrote simply, "There is a place here for the living and the not living." They trade places sometimes. It is only a small thing, this house on a rock, but it does not lie. It tells truth in the stead of people who cannot hold it. We can argue about truth and the truth of an inanimate thing, but we cannot argue very well against what the lighthouse does. It keeps going. In doing so, it invites story. Men will always come to tell the story, and the sea will always answer them with the one thing it knows how to give, a margin for names. So the light continues to keep watch on Háidrangur, the rock that would not be tamed. Boats will thrum and fail, men will misread the map, the world will make its small tragedies. The lighthouse will record them in the way a human ledger can, and in the way the sea consigns, into wave and memory, and the slow, unhurried language of echo. For now, if you ever find yourself near Vestmannaeyjar, and on a night when the weather is kind, look out across the water. You will see a white dot that seems almost to pulse like a heartbeat. Remember the men who put it there, the ones who were taken before they could finish telling their own stories. And remember that the best stories balance fact and feeling, dates and names and the small stubborn things the living leave behind. And if you believe the island listens, perhaps in the margins of the logbooks and in the faint smell of pipe smoke that still sometimes seems to hang under the lamp, you will add a name of your own to the ledger. Maybe it will stay. Maybe the sea will take it. Either way, the lighthouse will keep its light burning. It will keep its eye open and, in its way, keep the memory of human things safe, or at least in motion, until the sea decides otherwise.